moral purity. To live in God's will, we must maintain the one-flesh relationship in marriage. Here's Gene Getz.
This now grows out of a previous principle we'll look at in just a moment, but let's look at the text. Genesis 4, verse 17 and following. Cain knew his wife intimately. This is the guy that murdered his brother. Cain knew his wife intimately, and she conceived and gave birth to Enoch. And then Cain became the builder of a city. And he named the city Enoch after his son. Cain was a very successful builder, architect. Irad was born to Enoch. Irad fathered Mehujael. Mehujael fathered Methushael. And Methushael fathered Lamech, or Lamech. Lamech took 2 wives for himself, one named Ada, the other named Zillah. Now, as far as we know, in the biblical story, this is the first time we have a reference to polygamy. This is the first time we have a man taking more than one woman to be his wife. And what this does, it violates the one-flesh relationship that God instituted in the Garden of Eden. And that takes us back to principle 3 in Genesis. We looked at this last week. Call it marital union. In order to grow in oneness and unity, we're to follow God's plan regarding a one-man, one-woman relationship within the bonds of what? Marriage. God instituted this relationship to be within the bonds of marriage. And that's the biblical story. There is no room in the biblical story for a relationship between a man and woman that isn't a recognized marital relationship. Adam joined to his wife, not to a significant other or another female that wasn't his wife, or more than one female. It was his wife. Now, here we have a violation of that one-flesh relationship. And so you can see Principle 8 is really an extension of Principle 3 from Genesis. And basically, we know from the biblical story that any time that was violated, there was jealousy, there was family disunity, there were all kinds of problems associated with that relationship. And you can see that, as you work through the biblical story. God tolerated it, but he didn't approve of it as being within his will. But it was violated. And when it was violated, it created all kinds of problems. Now, one of the things I think we need to be aware of, and let me just simply share with you this, and I try to share with it sensitively. I was ministering in a particular city. And in this particular city, there were a lot of people that grew out of a particular religious organization that at one point in time, before it was illegal, practiced polygamy. It became illegal within the United States. The interesting thing is that it's still being practiced. And law enforcement just looks the other way. But I found out some interesting statistics in relationship to what was happening in the lives of women in that particular environment. Statistically, in that particular environment, there was more use of antidepressants than any place in the United States on the part of women. Now, what does that tell you? What is the root of depression? One of the major roots is anger. God did not design a family to have more than one woman in that family. I don't care what anybody says or even what they say within their deception. The other interesting thing is that within that particular segment of society, there were more suicides among women than in any other group of people within the United States. Now, those are things you don't hear, but those are statistics that are quickly covered up. But those who know the reality know that it happens. And it shouldn't surprise us, because that's a violation of the one-man, one-woman relationship that God created. And so the principle is very, very important. To live in God's will, we must maintain the one flesh relationship in marriage as God intended it. And the interesting thing, when you get into the New Testament, in Principle 6 in 1 Timothy, that we've outlined from 1 Timothy, it's this, that men who are appointed to serve as elders, overseers in the church are to be selected based on a comprehensive biblical criteria for measuring Christian maturity. But what is that criteria? What's right at the top of the list? Well, look at 1 Timothy chapter 3. An overseer, pastor, spiritual leader, therefore, must be above reproach, the husband of one wife, or literally a man of one woman. If you go to Titus, we see the same thing. Someone who is blameless, the husband of one wife. Here is the standard that God started and created right from the very beginning. One man, one woman, Adam and Eve. Anything in between is a violation of the will of God. So as the church came into existence, as the Lord came and established the church and the Holy Spirit came, it's going back to paradise. Not that there is paradise, which was certainly destroyed through sin, but going back to God's original intent for a relationship. Now, one of the reasons you see that was so important in the Roman Empire is that men had more than one woman in their life. That was a part of the Roman culture. It was very common for a man in the Roman culture, a Gentile particularly, not a Jew, although some Jews violated this, but among the Gentiles, the Roman Gentiles, it was very common for a man to have his wife. Legally, he couldn't have more than one wife because polygamy was outlawed in the Roman Empire. So Paul's not talking about polygamy here. He's talking about more than one woman in a man's life. And it was also common for a man, particularly if he's well-to-do, to have a prostitute down at the local temple. His wife knew all about it and one thing she could do about it. Because in the Roman world, if a guy wanted to get rid of his wife, all he had to say is, get out of here or I'll have you killed. We sometimes forget what that Roman world was like when the gospel penetrated that society. It was horrible. All you got to do is read some of the things the emperors did, Roman emperors. It was terrible. And the other thing that happened, because the Romans took a lot of Greeks into slavery, and many of these Greeks were very well trained individuals, artisans and jewelers and doctors and lawyers, and they took them into slavery. Totally different slavery situation than we've experienced in our culture. But the Romans took them into slavery, and it was very common for a well-to-do Roman to have a little slave girl, quote, end quote, for fun and games in the back room. Again, the wife knew all about it. Now, imagine what happened when the gospel penetrated this culture. You had people coming to Christ who had more than one woman in their life, and Paul had to deal with it, and he said, if you're going to be a spiritual leader in a church, you've got to really live by the standard that God has established. Because they were reaching out and touching people's lives and bringing them to Christ who were involved in that kind of culture. And that's a tremendous challenge, isn't it? But that explains why Paul had to deal with that. And you say, wow, what a situation. Well, the fact of the matter is that exists in some cultures of the world today. I was ministering in a South American city. I was attending a Bible study where I was teaching and sharing. And someone came up to me afterwards and said, see that young man over there? He's about 30 years old. He told me the story. He said he's been a believer now for a period of time, but there's something very unique about what's happened in his life and his wife's life and his family's life. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, when that boy, now 30, reached puberty, his father took him to a prostitute in this big city and said, teach him everything there is to know about sex. Just a young boy. And she did. And so he was involved in visiting a prostitute from the time he was just a young boy, reaching puberty, until he got married. Now, what do you suppose happened when he got married? You suppose he just stopped visiting the prostitute? No. After he got off work, prostitute, then home to his family. He had 3 children at this time, by the way. You say, how can that happen? It happened in the New Testament world. That happens in cultures today. Then this young man became a Christian. You think he had a problem with his addiction? You better believe it. And when I met him that night, they were all rejoicing because this young man had been clean from his immoral relationships, I think, for about 6 to 7 weeks. And they were all rejoicing, those who knew about this situation. Now you've got a New Testament story that happened right here in the 21st century in a city not too far from here. And that's very common. And the gospel penetrated the lives of these people. And this is reality. Now, the fact of the matter is, it goes all the way back to sin. It goes back to what we see happening here in this situation with Lamech. We see what happened as the world began to deteriorate, and it shouldn't surprise us that it happened. But the good news is the gospel of Jesus Christ changes people's lives. And we see that happening as well in the New Testament world. Now, there's a question here that I raise, and I think it's very important for us in our culture today, and that is, as men and women, what can we do to maintain moral purity in both our married and non-married relationships? Is that a valid question? It certainly is, because we have more things happening in our culture in married relationships. In fact, it's even being promoted, extramarital relationships and so forth, in a way that it's just illustrated and demonstrated, and it becomes a theme of so much of our media. But one of the things that as Christians that we need to do, and I remember discussing this with a group of guys that I was working through the qualities of maturity, and we were all interacting with this, and one of the first things that came to the top of the list was develop good communication with one another as couples. We've got to develop communication. If we don't understand each other, we're going to have problems. And as Christians, we ought to be able to communicate with each other in terms of our needs, our temptations, and so forth. We need to understand that and not be threatened by that. We've got to open up that communication. And secondly, we said, don't set up conflict situations for yourself. And this is true of marrieds, it's true of singles. If we set up situations where we're going to be tempted, we're headed for trouble. Because it's just the way we're made. And don't kid yourself. Advertisers know exactly how to tap into the way God made us and the way Satan wants to take advantage of it. And so we can't set up conflict situations for ourselves. Those of you who travel a lot, you know what I'm talking about. Pornography now is just a push button away. And one of the things that I've determined to do is in some situations, I don't even turn on the TV set. I can get along without Fox News for 24 to 48 hours. And that's tough. No. Because I know if I start flipping through those channels in some of those motels, I'm vulnerable. Because it's all designed to trap me. It's exactly what it's designed to do. And it doesn't mean that you're a pervert because you're tempted. They're tapping into the way God made you. And they know exactly what they're doing. And so if we purposely set up conflict situations for ourselves, we're going to face temptations. And then we need to fortify ourselves. We need to be ready with the Word, with prayer. And we need to be accountable. If this is something we have difficulty controlling, we need to be accountable. We need to have somebody that we call or somebody who asks us the tough questions. Are you really being faithful in mind and body in relationship to your marital vows?